The records spoke of gatherings where members shared doctrine, lists of targeted families, and ritual techniques drawn from scripture and foreign rites alike. They cataloged victims, intentions, and theological justifications. Among the most wrenching passages were the words recorded from the Whitmore wives, each expressing a mixture of terror and reverence as ritual swallowed them one by one. Then came the section recounting the crackdown. The church, realizing a pattern of disappearances, had launched a private investigation. Brigham Young himself had been alerted. The order's influence had spread farther than anyone suspected, and swift action had been taken. Excommunications, disappearances, forced banishments to remote corners of the territory. Blackwood fled before he could be captured. But according to the tablets, the order did not die. It splintered. Some members were absorbed into the anonymity of Western mining camps. Others relocated to California, Nevada, Colorado. A handful established new chambers, cruder than the Utah originals, but recognizable in structure and symbolism. When Elder Tanner finished reading the last tablet, he understood that the Whitmore chamber was not merely a crime scene. It was a chapter in a longer book of blood. The final decision faced the first presidency. A decision not just about the truth that lay beneath the stone, but about the future weight of secrecy. The leadership weighed the consequences in a room far above ground, far from the cold breath of the chambers. They chose silence. The chambers were sealed with concrete, recorded only in locked archives. The investigation continued quietly, through agents who traced order remnants into the 1870s and 1880s, who disrupted cells before they could enact further rites. Jeremiah Blackwood was found at last in 1895 in Colorado, an old man still practicing his dark theology. His notes revealed the full scope: 15 ritual sites, more than 200 victims, and a doctrine refined over decades of hidden work. But none of this entered public history. Families were listed as departed, missionaries reassigned, records locked. The truth slid back underground, beneath soil and memory. Yet the story still trembles at the edge of the present. The winter of 1847 echoing into a century that never truly buried it. When the platforms were removed, the truth beneath them shifted from suspicion to certainty. Each platform concealed a burial niche. Within each lay a human body, preserved by deliberate means, wrapped, prepared, arranged as though death itself had been a ceremony. The wounds were precise, each heart pierced once, the blade delivered with ritual steadiness. Each woman had been dressed in white robes embroidered with symbols of faith and adorned with personal items chosen for spiritual meaning. It was execution as sacrament, or sacrament as execution, depending on whose vision shaped the act. Stone tablets lined the walls in shallow recesses, each etched with a record of the rituals. They detailed the sequence of prayers, the scriptural citations twisted into sanction, the final words spoken by each participant. The tablets included Ezekiel's voice, calm, assured, and the wives' voices too, recorded by a hand that had shaped their final hours into doctrine. The women's words, trembling with yearning and fear, spoke of exaltation, sealing celestial glory. They were not the cries of captives, but the confessions of believers caught in the gravity of a terrible conviction. What unsettled Elder Tanner most was not only the thoroughness of the records, but their tone. Triumph threaded through tragedy, a sense of revelation guiding every stroke of the chisel. Whoever created the chamber believed they were building a sacred place meant to endure. But the four women were not the only ones claimed by it. Carved records revealed that 8 other victims had been interred here between 1848 and 1855. Men, women, and children from 3 other families whose disappearances had been quietly explained by mission calls or distant travels no one ever verified. The chamber had been used regularly, its drainage channels and stonework designed for repeated rituals. The killers had not been improvising. They had been following a pattern, a higher law as they believed it, one revealed through a chain of private revelations tied together by a single man's influence. It was in the deeper recess of the chamber that the investigators found the hidden passage. A false wall yielded to pressure, revealing a narrow descent. The air inside carried a different stillness, older, more guarded. Here lay the inner sanctum. This lowest chamber was smaller, but built with exquisite precision. Archways supported the ceiling with engineering skill beyond frontier craftsmanship. On a stone table at the center lay maps of the Utah Territory carved into its surface. Settlements were marked with symbols. Certain families were listed with annotations concerning readiness, purity, and capacity for elevation. It was less a map than a ledger of chosen souls. Stone tablets lined the walls, these containing the theological heart of the order. The leader's name surfaced for the first time: Jeremiah Blackwood. According to the records, Blackwood had claimed private revelations from Joseph Smith, revelations he insisted had been withheld from the general church, for fear the people were not yet prepared. These teachings included a hierarchy of sacrifice, a doctrine he called the order of eternal sacrifice, an extreme extension of celestial marriage and consecration. He believed that true exaltation demanded a family lay down its own life, willingly or otherwise, as the ultimate declaration of faith. The tablets detailed how Blackwood had selected his followers. He targeted men of deep devotion but solitary temperament, especially those in plural marriages where isolated wives could disappear without immediate suspicion. Ezekiel Whitmore was one of them, chosen for his skills, his isolation, and a spiritual hunger that made him susceptible to claims of higher law. Blackwood's methods were patient, almost pastoral. He fed Ezekiel teachings in private conversation, letters and meetings whispered behind barn doors and within circles of exhausted pioneers prepared to hear promises of purpose. By the winter of 1847, Ezekiel had been convinced that he and his wives were chosen instruments in a pattern stretching beyond mortal sight. Other families across the territory had been selected too. The order operated through cells, small groups of believers who communicated through coded letters. Ritual sites were built in several settlements. Some had been destroyed during the purge in the 1850s, but others had gone undiscovered. Across the tablets, references surfaced to chambers near Ogden, Parowan, Manti, and even remote places beyond Mormon boundaries, locations where men could disappear into the anonymity of mining towns. The deeper tablets revealed a truth the church had never fully known. The order had not been a fringe eccentricity, but a coordinated conspiracy threading through a decade of pioneer history. 4 feet below the surface, workmen unearthed a constructed stone chamber, square and deliberate. It was sealed with a flat rock that held the sediment of time like a lid. Inside lay 4 piles of clothing, each set folded with careful hands. Dresses, undergarments, shoes, combs, mirrors, small purses containing identification and papers. The names were unmistakable: Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth. The preservation was uncanny. Dry stone and shelter had kept what the shallow graves had hidden. When Brother Samuel Morrison, the supervisor, brought these items to Bishop Harold Stevenson, what was folklore became evidence. Word traveled fast to Salt Lake. A delegation arrived within a day, led by a man who had access to the church's private vaults, Elder James Tanner of the Quorum of the 12. The letters and garments in the chamber changed the moral arithmetic of the old story. Among the finds were letters written by each woman. They were not frantic pleas. They read like testament. Sarah thanked Providence for selection. Rebecca's writing spoke of theological reasoning and cited arcane doctrines about atonement and sealing. Mary wrote of her unborn child and offered the life in terms that made grief and faith indistinguishable. Ruth sent a short note of love and devotion. The language of the letters suggested consent, or something that could be read as consent, an acceptance of fate shaped by doctrinal argument and intimate persuasion. Elder Tanner ordered the site secured. He pried open the church's sealed files and found Bishop Curtis's old notebooks, letters, and the quiet papers that had been tucked away like contraband. What was in those papers expanded the solitary suspicion into something worse, a pattern. Dozens of cases across the early years, missing women and children, departures explained as mission callings or eastward travel, now read like echoes of the Whitmore winter when stacked together. When Tanner compared dates and names, a pattern of disappearances between 1847 and 1855 emerged. Families who had reported relations gone for spiritual reasons. Men who had spoken of revelations and who later drifted away. Even more unsettling were references in Ezekiel's notebooks to correspondence with other men. Letters signed only with initials, mentioning a pattern accomplished and a work completed according to the pattern. The discoveries at Mill Creek unlatched a door the church had bolted decades earlier. What lay behind it would demand choices that would weigh doctrine, reputation, and mercy against the obligation to honor victims. Elder Tanner saw with the eyes of a steward the ruin and the duty. The stones kept their secrets for decades. The letters and journals had waited long enough to force the church into a terrible reckoning. As Elder Tanner's team peeled back the layers of earth beneath the Mill Creek site, they learned that the first stone chamber was not an end, but a threshold. Beneath it lay a second chamber carved directly into the bedrock, a space larger, colder, and filled with symbols that did not belong to any single faith. The walls were lined with stones fitted so carefully they seemed less built than grown. Carvings wrapped the chamber in a cipher of intent. Temple emblems mingled with Masonic geometry. Egyptian figures whispered from the stone, and strange sigils curved like the remnants of forgotten rites. It was a vocabulary of belief bent into darkness. At the center stood a granite altar, its surface smoothed by hands that had tended it with purpose. Stains darkened the porous stone. Later tests would confirm what no one wanted to name at first glance. Around the altar stood 4 smaller platforms, each inscribed with a woman's name: Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth, and the winter dates that marked the months of their disappearance. Passages, carved with painstaking care, wound around the platforms, twisting familiar scripture into something colder. Teachings invoked to justify death as devotion. Above the central altar, an inscription read, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends, and greater still, the love that lays down the lives of the beloved for the glory of God." The sentence seemed to hover in the cold air like a breath. In Rebecca's room, a loose floorboard gave like a sigh. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal, the edges dark with the damp of winter. The final entry was dated December 20th, 1847. The handwriting, usually careful, trembled. The sentence was short and jagged. He says, "We must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family. But I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven." The confession read like a prayer and a warning braided into one. When Curtis held the journal in his hands, he felt the heat of someone's private fear. Behind the cabin, where Ezekiel claimed to have been expanding a root cellar, the earth had been turned with a zeal that made no sense for food. The hole stretched and sank beneath frozen soil in stages. Scrape marks indicated work by hands that returned again and again. Among the loose clods, the bishop found fragments. A scrap of patterned fabric matched a dress Rebecca favored. A small worn wedding ring matched the description of Sarah's. In a cleared patch lay the ghost of fire pits arranged with peculiar deliberation. Rings of charcoal and ash set in a pattern that suggested ritual rather than warmth. Burned pages, their ink still legible in places, contained phrases that shocked the bishop. Phrases about blood atonement and eternal sealing twisted into rhetoric that treated sacrifice as ordinance. The burned fragments were not scripture as the church taught it, but a private gloss, jagged and sanctified. Inside Ezekiel and Sarah's room was a hidden compartment, and within it a stack of notebooks written in a hand that became progressively more unhinged. Ezekiel recorded his studies of obscure texts, his late-night readings of manuscripts that flirted with Masonic lore and foreign rites. He wrote of a principle he called ultimate consecration, an idea that God's love demanded everything, and that families might be made celestial through the surrender of even their most beloved. His last pages overflowed in capital letters and fevered metaphors. Visions of eternal families sealed by blood. Phrases that read like liturgy but smelled of madness. He described receiving visions that named his household as chosen. The entries charted a slow, deliberate conversion from carpenter to zealot. The evidence laid a terrible shape across the winter. The 4 women had not simply left. Their belongings, the journal, the fire pattern, the disturbed grave-like earth pointed to something more permanent and purposeful. The bishop's conclusion, written quietly and then hidden in a private drawer, was blunt. The women had been taken from life in some ceremony that Ezekiel had designed. Yet when the men asked about Ezekiel, the cabin's one remaining presence, he was gone. He had vanished into the wide country, as if the land itself had swallowed him whole. Tracks that suggested flight led only to a faint horizon and then dissolved. For Bishop Curtis, the problem was immediate and corrosive. The Mormon people were a fragile polity in a hostile nation. Plural marriage was already a political tinderbox. Scandal could be wielded by congressmen, courts, and enemies who wished to use any misdeed to justify persecution. Curtis took the facts as a kind of terrible inventory and made a decision steeped in fear. The official church record would not be opened to the public. The few who knew the truth were sworn to secrecy. The Whitmore cabin was dismantled. The disturbed ground was rolled and reseeded, as if to erase not merely the scene, but the memory of what had happened there. The church bought the acreage and quietly marked it unsuitable for settlement. To most, the 4 women were recorded as having gone east for reasons of family and mission. To the few who held the evidence, the story became an ache that one could not air without danger. Rumor did what secrecy could not. In a town where everyone's life intersected with everyone else's, whispers multiplied. Some said Ezekiel had snapped under isolation. Others said he had been driven by theology too literal and too eager. A few darker tongues suggested the impossible, that the women had gone willingly, convinced by Ezekiel's revelations that their deaths would be exaltations rather than ends. This explanation haunted the community because it suggested something more dangerous than a single man's derangement. It suggested a contagious belief, a theological fever that could spread. The story might have remained a local scar if not for the slow, indifferent demand of growth. By 1920, the valley had changed. Trails had become streets, and where brush once met sky, there were homes and meeting places to serve expanding wards. Plans were drawn for a new Mill Creek meeting house. The men who would lay its foundation did not look for old sins beneath the sod. They only sought level ground and stone that would sit true. On an October morning, steam drills and shovels found something that a generation had intended to keep asleep. Visitors in December 1847 described a household that seemed to flourish. Ezekiel made frequent trips to town, trading goods, attending meetings, keeping the outward rituals of participation. Bishop William Curtis, who visited in early December, recorded in his official journal praise for their unity and prosperity, noting how the family seemed a model of righteous order. But Bishop Curtis kept a private diary, and in its margins his voice softened into unease. There was a harmony, he wrote, that felt rehearsed. 4 women finishing one another's sentences, moving with an odd synchrony that suggested a single will split and multiplied. He noticed marks on their wrists, small cuts they attributed to kitchen work. But the cuts matched one another in age and depth, identical as if made by a practiced hand. The notes the bishop kept for himself bore the shadow of suspicion. Winter tightened. Snow began in mid-November and did not let go. Temperatures plummeted to -20s. Wind drove like a scouring animal. For those near the main settlement, communal stores and shared labor softened the blow. For isolated homesteads, the season was a test of preparation and faith. The last certain sighting of all 4 women together occurred on December 19, 1847. A hunting party passed and saw smoke from the Whitmore chimney. Sarah and Rebecca accepted a gift of venison and declined to send anyone back for Christmas worship. They would hold their own, they said. What came after slid into inexplicable quiet. On January 8, 1848, Ezekiel arrived at the settlement, a man who seemed to have aged years in weeks. His clothes were disordered, his face grown ragged. Witnesses described his eyes as having the look of a man who had seen beyond ordinary grief. In Bishop Curtis's cabin, Ezekiel offered a new explanation. Sarah had received a revelation calling her east to care for a sick sister in Missouri. He said she had left with travelers passing through. Bishop Curtis heard the story and felt its edges. There would be no travelers moving east in midwinter. Sarah had never mentioned a sister in Missouri. When pressed, Ezekiel's account wavered. Missionaries, then trappers. The story contorted to meet pressure. Most unsettling was his insistence that the bishop not visit the cabin. The household was in a period of spiritual purification, he said, one that demanded isolation. The bishop left the meeting with his official notes intact, but his private entries darker. He wrote, "Brother Whitmore speaks of revelations, but I fear he hides something truer and far more earthly. His manner is more guilty than grieving. His words contradict season and reason." 3 weeks later, Ezekiel returned with another tale. Rebecca, too, had been called east, this time to teach. Again, the bishop pushed. No one travels those roads in February. Ezekiel grew erratic, invoking God's mysterious ways, mentioning trials of faith. Bishop Curtis, alarmed, organized a party to visit the Whitmore cabin on February 3rd. The ride through drift and wind took most of the day. What they found stayed with them. Ezekiel alone by a modest fire, rooms hastily cleared, heavy items left behind as if departure had been improbable. and beyond the cabin, a mound of disturbed earth far larger than any root cellar should require. Ezekiel said he had been enlarging storage. The men found little reason to believe such an explanation when the ground was frozen solid. In the night, one man claimed he heard faint weeping from beneath the floorboards, a sound dismissed by some as wind, but that lodged in the memory of Thomas Garrett, who would never shake the certainty that he had heard human sorrow. Bishop Curtis left unsettled, his private diary filling with speculation. He feared acts that might bring shame on their people, that isolation and the strain of plural marriage had tipped a man into unspeakable desperation. But he also faced a cruel calculus. The community existed under federal scrutiny, and scandal over polygamy could be weaponized against them. So he chose watchfulness over exposure, a quiet vigil for a resolution that spring might bring. When the ice loosened in April, Bishop Curtis went back to the Whitmore place with men who could read what the thaw often revealed. The cabin looked as if it had been slept in once, and then left to dust. A thick film settled over the furniture, and the rooms that had once belonged to Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth bore the tidy emptiness of hurried erasure rather than the graceful disorder of departure. Yet ordinary clues of leaving were absent. No packed trunks, no carefully folded quilts ready for travel, no footprints leading away in a pattern that could be followed. Instead, there were things that did not fit Ezekiel's story. The winter of 1857 began like a blank page, white, cold, and refusing to be read. In a remote Mormon settlement in the Utah Territory, 4 women vanished without a trace, their footsteps erased as if the earth itself had refused to keep count. Ezekiel Whitmore, their husband, told a simple story. They had left to visit kin in the east. The claim was possible only on paper. In the valley that year, the weather was a wall. Travel eastward in the teeth of that winter was an impossibility few would attempt, and none would survive. For more than 6 decades, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kept the episode locked away in private records. Then, in 1920, men with shovels and steam drills removed the topsoil of a meeting house foundation and revealed what no ledger or quiet conversation could conceal. What they found beneath the earth demanded that leaders confront a chapter of their past they had long preferred to forget. It would reveal questions about faith, family, and what a people will justify when building a promised life in an unforgiving place. The Salt Lake Valley of 1847 was a geography of extremes, promise braided with hunger. When Brigham Young uttered, "This is the place," he was surveying a landscape that many considered barren, alkaline flats hemmed by mountain ranges that could turn a summer road into a winter prison. For the Mormon pioneers, isolation was both a refuge and a crucible. They had fled persecution in Missouri and Illinois, carrying not just belongings, but a theology that stitched salvation to community and obedience. To them, desolation was providence, an opportunity to fashion Zion where outsiders could not reach. Ezekiel arrived in the valley with the second wave of migration in late September 1847. He was 34, a carpenter by trade from Vermont, a man who had converted after hearing Joseph Smith speak in Nauvoo. Unlike the advance company that had come with Brigham Young, and unlike those better provisioned, Ezekiel's party pressed west with thin stores and lean shelter. He carried with him a household that made his situation complicated. 4 wives, a plural family bound by the secret practice of plural marriage that had begun to take hold within certain circles of the church. Each wife brought a life, skills, and small histories that mattered as much as the food stores they could stretch through winter. Sarah was 31, steady and weathered. married to Ezekiel for 8 years. She was barren, which within the theology of their community made plural marriage not simply doctrinal, but necessary, an avenue to the fullest promises of celestial hope. Rebecca, 27, had been chosen by Sarah herself. Educated, bilingual in English and German, she read aloud the world and asked uncomfortable questions about doctrine that most men preferred not to answer. Ezekiel seemed to welcome her intellect. Mary Kellerman, 24 and pregnant on the journey west, had been orphaned in the chaos of their earlier migrations. She preserved food with a particular talent and had built a larder of dried fruits and vegetables that promised life through the cold months. Ruth Caldwell was barely 19, placed with Ezekiel 3 months before departure by elders who insisted protection after her family perished in the Missouri conflicts. She brought youth and a readiness to labor that steadied the household in small, practical ways. They settled near a small creek 8 miles southeast of the main Salt Lake settlement, where water ran even in winter and the soil held the faint promise of cultivation. Ezekiel chose the spot for its seclusion as much as for its utility. He was a private man, one who preferred timber and nails and the quiet of domestic order to the bustle of communal duties. That autumn, he worked with a focused severity, building a log cabin with separate rooms for each wife, laying a stone foundation, stockpiling supplies. The cabin stood alone, sturdy, a single bright point in the sleeping valley. Nearest neighbors were scarce, 3 miles to a family of Danish converts, a distance that would become vast once snows came. The early Mormon settlements depended on each household. Survival was a communal enterprise. Leaders watched plural marriages with pragmatic care, not only for doctrinal integrity, but to manage the practicalities that followed. Men practicing plural marriage were expected to maintain balance and harmony, to be a stabilizing force in a fragile society. Ezekiel's household, at first glance, met those expectations. Sarah managed the domestic rhythms with quiet efficiency. Rebecca oversaw records and taught herself rudimentary medicine. Mary preserved food. Ruth took on heavy labor with woman's hands often smaller than the load she bore.